And when it comes to precision shooting, and that could be 100-yard bench rest, it could be 1,000-yard F-class, it could be ELR. Neck tension is one of those things that you will always hear about as sort of a non-negotiable. I don't know very many long-range shooters that I shoot with who aren't really trying to manage their neck tension. And, there's ways that people sort of gauge this. Some of it is by saying, well, my seating pressure is lighter or heavier because of some way that I'm affecting, the actual neck, whether through sizing with a bushing. In this case, I'm going to show you guys how I do my internal expansion, because I feel like that's the most critical. So whether you're using some kind of a neck bushing or a full-length die that is custom without the bushings, whatever, you are doing something to these necks to obviously make them a little smaller. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to reload them. But no matter how good that is, with rare exception to some really expensive custom dies, your outside neck dimensions aren't always going to be consistent to what the inside needs to be. And so that's where expanding, whether by using some form of a mandrel or a gauge pin, is going to really come into play. Places like Brownells and Midway and stuff have sold a traditional, I'll show you here, a traditional carbide mandrel from Sinclair. They're usually labeled on the top as whether they're carbide or not. This one happens to be a 283 carbide mandrel. But for me, what's going to happen is if I'm sizing this down and I use a 283 mandrel to expand it, there's going to be about 0.5 thousandths spring back. So that really means by the time I put a 284 bullet in it, I'm going to be at about 1.5 thousandths neck tension, you could say. And I don't, for me, that's a little too heavy. I want a little bit less neck tension. So what I've done is I've ordered these incremental mandrels from 21st Century. He does a fantastic job of labeling them. So this one happens to be a 283.5. And what I do, and I learned this trick from someone else, but I keep all of my mandrels and gauge pins inside of a little 22 or a 223 box. I take a piece of paper towel, I spray it with some Tri-Flow or some kind of ballistol, whatever you want for an anti-corrosion. And I have never had a problem with any of these tool steel pieces corroding in any way. So this is sort of my little trick that I will pass on to you. In any event, I am using the 283.5. And the reason I'm using that one is because this happens to be virgin brass. If I run a 284 mandrel through it, which is what I will run through it after it's been sized again, then it's just not enough neck tension. I can actually push the bullets in. So on virgin brass, I go down 0.5 thousandths to 283.5. Once this brass has been shot, annealed, resized, then I will use a 284 mandrel on it. And that will give me roughly 0.5 thousandths neck tension, which is really where I like to be. To give you an idea, if I am using my 21st Century Arbor press, which is the hydro press, and it's got its gauge on it, I barely get a register on it. I want to say it's roughly 1 or 2 psi at the most when I'm loading with 0.5 thousandths neck tension. If I'm loading on, if I take that same brass and put it through a 283 mandrel, I'm going to be closer to 20 on it. So it is a considerable difference. Now, I shoot with guys who load 2, 3, 4 thousandths neck tension, and they don't have a problem. A lot of it comes down to how you develop your loads, what you're comfortable with, and kind of where you want that to be. I don't honestly think there's a right answer. I think the only thing you really have to worry about is that it's a consistent neck tension. So whether you want 10 thousandths neck tension or 0.5 thousandths neck tension, it just needs to all be the same, because as far as I'm concerned, that's going to give you the most consistent release out of the brass. I am one of those people that uses one shot before I put it through a steel mandrel. I take a bore mop, I spray it down, I do about 5 or 6 brass at a time. I always point it upwards so that if there is anything, it drips out. It's pretty rare because I keep it pretty lightly lubed, but I'll do 5 or 6 at a time. And that just gives me a little bit of lubrication in there to run over the steel mandrels. And then I do use the Imperial graphite dry neck lube and for seating the bullets, and I'll just dip the bullets lightly in there. So in any event, you can see how nice the Sinclair mandrel holder works. I keep it because I'm loading on a 550. These are free floated dies, but in and of themselves, the Sinclair Gen 2 does have an O-ring inside of it. So it is pretty free floating to begin with. It does give you a little bit of play as far as that mandrel being able to sort of work its way up and down a little bit. But again, you can see this has just a little bit of wiggle and a little bit of float in it, and I really like that. So let me see if I can get you a better angle here. And you can kind of see the process. So I'm not going to load through the entire process, but if you've watched my other videos, you know this is my expander. This is going to be my powder drop, and that's obviously my seeder. Now, you might be asking, well, how come you're not using gauge pins? If anybody knows me, they know that I've used gauge pins for a long time. And for those that aren't familiar, gauge pins are incredibly accurate tool worker instruments. You can buy them in giant kits. You can buy them one by one. You can get them in just about any increment you want. And what it's designed to do is tell you that if this fits in here, then it's a particular size. Think of it as like a caliper, except instead of having an adjustment, you keep running these through it in smaller increments until it actually fits, and then you know that you have a particular size. The gauge pins work great. I have nothing against gauge pins. If you're going to use a gauge pin, you want to use something like a Hornady or RCBS or somebody's bullet puller, and you're going to put it in there, and then it's going to sit in your press, and you can use it to expand your necks. The only downside to this, personally, is that when you're loading on a press that doesn't have a lot of clearance, that's really where these mandrels are going to be a lot more effective, because in order to use something like this on a Dillon, you are going to have to create your own spacer that raises this up so that as the brass is pushed up, it's expanding without slamming into the die. It's kind of a pain in the butt. It makes it really tough to access these if you want to change them out. And so for the loading that I do now, I just honestly don't use the expander dies, which is why I was so excited when John over at 21st Century brought out his new line of the mandrels. And so I have everything from 2825, 283, 35, and 4. He does actually make a 2845, which is oversized. I don't really have a need for it, but there could be potential cases where if you wanted really light neck tension and you were kind of oversizing your necks down, that combination could be something that could work for you. I've heard of a couple other interesting ways to use it that I won't repeat, but by and large, 284 is the largest that I'm going to use. And so I've used these a little bit now. I've been really happy with them. Again, I wish they were carbide. I don't know anybody that doesn't wish they were carbide, but then again, you know, they're a fraction of what a carbide bit would cost. I'm guessing that if he was to make these in carbide, they're probably going to be north of 60 or 70 bucks a piece, probably closer to 80 or 90, knowing the tolerances and material that he likes to use. They'd probably be one heck of a carbide mandrel. But when you're buying 4 or 5 of them, you know, that adds up pretty quickly. So I think the tool still makes sense. And, you know, the time it takes to do a little bit of lubing on the inside of your case neck is not the end of the world. Of course, if you don't like one shot, you could definitely dip it in the dry lube instead and expand your necks that way. I know guys that do both without any issues. So anyway, let me show you real quick. But just, it really is just a nice sizing up. I usually let it dwell a little bit. Now in my normal process, they have a pretty consistent dwell because I use my powder throw as a timer, more or less. So they all get about the same dwell time. If for some reason I have a hiccup with some part of the process, I'll lower my RAM so that one doesn't end up with a significantly longer dwell time than the other. I would hate for one to be, you know, a lot looser than another. But this gives me a really nice neck tension, and then I'm just going to go ahead and show you here without putting any lube on it. But, you know, it just gives a really nice, light neck tension for sizing a bullet in there. So you get to play around with it a little bit. I would recommend that if you're going to buy, you know, these Mandrels, make sure you get 3 or 4, maybe 5 different sizes, because depending on, again, your process of sizing and stuff like that, and the neck tension you want to achieve, and you're obviously going to want to do some testing to see what your gun likes, you're going to need more than one. Don't just buy one and say, well, that's the neck tension I'm at, because, you know, it may not be what works best for you. Anyway, hope this helps a little bit. Kind of show off a little bit with a couple different ways to do your neck tension, and we'll see you next time.